The golden glow of the gala's chandeliers shimmered off the marble floors, casting the ballroom in a light that felt more like a stage than a celebration. Among the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, Nia Robinson moved with a rhythmic, quiet precision, her red apron and simple ponytail serving as a cloak of invisibility. In this world of excess, she was merely a shadow, a silent fixture whose only purpose was to serve without being seen, and to remember every whispered confession she overheard. She was a ghost in the house of her enemies, existing on the periphery with a singular, dangerous goal: gather enough leverage to burn the Choi empire to the ground and disappear before the smoke cleared. But tonight, the shadow was forced into the light. Dae-Hyun Choi, a man whose cold authority commanded the room's very heartbeat, Dae stood before her like a god carved from obsidian. Despite the frantic warnings from her supervisor to stay low and keep her head down, Nia didn't flinch when the wineglass tilted. As the crimson liquid splashed across her chest, a public mark of his arrogance, she didn't offer the expected sob of shame. Instead, she looked up with a calm, terrifying smile, her steady eyes promising that he had just humiliated the only person alive who knew exactly where his bodies were buried. Now the golden warmth of the ballroom was an illusion, a gilded mask draped over a nest of vipers. As Nia moved through the crowd, her red apron served as a cloak of invisibility. To the titans of industry and the scions of old money, she was not a woman. She was a mobile tray, a silent utility designed to ensure their glasses never touched the bottom. She moved with a rhythmic, practiced grace, her eyes never lingering too long on any one face, her ears always tuned to the frequency of the room. "Well, the docks are secure," a senator whispered behind a silk fan, leaning toward a man whose silhouette was sharp enough to cut glass. "The shipment moves at midnight. Just make sure your people don't leave a paper trail this time." Nia tilted her head ever so slightly as she refilled their flutes. Docks, midnight, paper trail. She didn't need a notebook. She had spent years training her mind to be a steel trap. Each name, each date, then each illicit transaction was filed away in the archives of her memory. She was a ghost gathering the tinder that would eventually set this entire world ablaze. She navigated the perimeter of the dance floor, her presence as unobtrusive as the scent of expensive lilies in the air. She watched the way power moved, how a hand on a shoulder was often a threat disguised as a greeting, and how a smile was frequently a baring of teeth. She saw the nervous sweat on the brow of a young heir who had clearly gambled away more than his inheritance, and the cold, predatory hunger in the eyes of the brokers circling him. Every clink of silver and every burst of artificial laughter was data. Nia knew who was sleeping with whose spouse, who was laundering money through offshore charities, and who was one bad quarterly report away from a prison cell. They talked freely in front of her, their arrogance blinding them to the fact that the help had ears. They treated her like furniture, assuming she lacked the intellect or the interest to understand the gravity of their words. Her heart hammered a steady, silent drum against her ribs. It was a dangerous game, standing in the heart of the fortress built on her family's ruins. But the adrenaline was her fuel. She was the invisible observer, the silent witness to the rot beneath the marble. As she approached a group near the grand staircase, she caught the scent of expensive tobacco and something metallic, the unmistakable aura of Dae-Hyun Choi. The air around him was different, heavier and colder, as if he carried the winter with him into the midsummer heat of the gala. Nia's grip on her tray tightened for a fleeting second before her discipline took over. She smoothed her expression into one of blank professional servitude. She wasn't ready for him yet, But as she stepped into his orbit to offer a fresh glass, she realized the invisible walls she had built around herself were about to be tested. The hunter was no longer just watching from the shadows. She was walking directly into the light. The shift wasn't loud. It was a sudden, chilling vacuum that sucked the air out of the grand ballroom. Conversations didn't stop so much as they withered, dying on the tongues of senators and CEOs alike. At the heavy oak doors, the light seemed to fracture, a bending around the silhouette of Dae-Hyun Choi. He didn't enter the room with the bluster of a man seeking attention. He entered with the absolute, terrifying certainty of a man who already owned it. Nia felt the change in her marrow. The ambient heat of hundreds of bodies seemed to plummet as he stepped onto the marble. He moved with a clinical, predatory grace, his black-tailored suit absorbing the golden glare of the chandeliers rather than reflecting it. Beside him, and his security detail moved like silent shadows, but they were unnecessary. Dae-Hyun's own presence was a physical barrier, a wall of cold authority that kept the world at a respectful, fearful distance. She watched him from the periphery, her tray of champagne flutes held with iron stillness. He didn't look at the crowd. His gaze was fixed forward, sharp and obsidian, navigating the room not as a guest, but as a judge. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. Yet those around him leaned in with a desperate, frantic hunger, their faces pale under the warm lights. He was the gravity around which this entire elite solar system orbited, and even the most powerful men in the city seemed to shrink in his shadow. He stopped near a high-profile developer, a man Nia knew was currently laundering millions through a shell company in Macau. The developer's hands shook, a micro-tremor that sent ripples through the amber liquid in his glass. And Dae-Hyun merely stood there, his face a mask of sculpted stone, his silence a weapon more effective than any threat. He didn't need to bark orders. His mere arrival was a reminder of the debts owed and the blood that had already been spilled to pave these marble floors. To the room, he was a king. To Nia, he was the target. She noted the way his jaw remained tight, the way his eyes never truly settled, searching for the slightest crack in the armor of those around him. He was a man of precision and zero margin for error. He prided himself on seeing every play, every hidden hand, and every potential traitor. As Nia began to move toward his quadrant of the room, her heart was a steady, rhythmic pulse against the backdrop of the ballroom's forced gaiety. She was the one variable he hadn't calculated. He saw the elite, the powerful and the dangerous, but he was entirely blind to the woman in the red apron standing 3 feet away. The shadow of the king was long and dark, but Nia Robinson was already comfortable in the dark. She stepped closer, the crystal on her tray chiming a low, melodic warning that only she could understand. The king was on his throne, but he had no idea that the foundations were already hollow. The moment of collision was as quiet as it was violent. As Nia navigated the space between a senator's booming laughter and a billionaire's hushed greed, she felt the air grow thin and brittle. She was steps away from Dae-Hyun Choi, her tray balanced with the precision of a tightrope walker, when he moved. It wasn't a stumble. Men like Dae-Hyun didn't stumble. It was a deliberate, predatory redirection of his path. Nia's shoulder brushed against the fine wool of his sleeve, a contact so brief it should have been negligible, but in a room where every guest was a god and every server was a ghost, it was a transgression. The ballroom fell into a suffocating silence. Dae-Hyun stopped, his back to the room, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the distant, frantic pulse of the orchestra. He turned slowly, his features carved from ice, his narrowed eyes focusing on the red apron that marked Nia as a servant. The crowd of elites, sensing blood in the water, drew back in a ripple of silk and diamonds, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and practiced disdain. "You're in my way," Dae-Hyun said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried to every corner of the marble hall, on cold and sharp as a razor. Nia didn't look down. She didn't offer the frantic, stuttering apology the room expected. She simply stood her ground, her gaze meeting his with an unblinking clarity that seemed to catch him off guard. The silence stretched, turning the air heavy and electric. Slowly, with a terrifying clinical grace, Dae-Hyun reached for the glass of full-bodied Cabernet on her tray. His fingers were steady, his expression neutral. He held the glass aloft for a second, but the deep red liquid shimmering under the chandeliers, and then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tilted it forward. The wine hit Nia's chest in a dark, spreading bloom. It soaked into the fabric of her uniform, dripping down the red apron and staining the white cotton beneath. It looked like a gunshot wound, a visceral mark of humiliation in front of the city's most powerful witnesses. Gasps echoed through the room. A woman covered her mouth, and the developer Nia had seen earlier looked away, unable to meet the cruelty of the moment. Dae-Hyun let the empty glass drop. It didn't shatter. It landed with a dull, final thud on the thick carpet. He leaned in, his scent, expensive tobacco and cold iron, overwhelming her senses. "Know your place, girl," he whispered, his eyes searching for the tears, the tremor, the ruin of her dignity. But Nia didn't break. As the cold wine seeped into her skin, she felt a surge of ancient or crystalline power. She didn't wipe the stain. She didn't lower her head. Instead, she tilted it slightly, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips, a smile that held the weight of 1,000 secrets. It was the smile of a woman who had just watched her enemy commit the final mistake. It was a silent, terrifying promise that reached through his armor and touched the hidden fear he didn't know he had. The knowing smile rippled through the ballroom like a virus, freezing the guests in their tracks. Dae-Hyun's mask of cold authority flickered for a fraction of a second, a shadow of confusion crossing his face. He had sought to humiliate her, but as she stood there, drenched in his wine and smiling at his doom, he realized he was the one who was truly exposed. The aftermath of the splash was not the explosion the guests had braced for. It was something far more unnerving. Dae-Hyun stood amidst the wreckage of his own composure, his hand still hovering where the glass had been. He looked for the trembling lip, the downward cast of eyes, the frantic scrubbing at the stain, the usual choreography of those he crushed. Instead, he found Nia's smile. It was a small, razor-sharp thing that didn't reach her eyes, which remained as vast and unreadable as a midnight sea. He turned away, his movements stiff, the silence of the ballroom clinging to him like a shroud. He retreated to the shadowed VIP lounge, but the air there felt just as thin. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that curve of her lips. It wasn't the smile of a servant. It was the smile of a person holding a detonator. A micro-tremor of doubt, unfamiliar and unwelcome, rippled through him. He was a man of absolute control, his life built on the meticulous burial of his past. He had sanitized his history with blood and gold until not a single fingerprint remained. Yet, as he sat in the plush velvet chair, the scent of the spilled Cabernet seemed to morph into something metallic, something older. August 14th. The date flashed in his mind like a strobe light. It was the night the foundations of the Choi Empire had been poured over a secret so dark it had no name. He had been certain the only witnesses were either in his employ or in the ground. But the way that girl had looked at him, not with the blankness of the help, but with the terrifying recognition of an equal, suggested a leak he hadn't accounted for. "Find out who she is," he murmured to the shadow standing by the door. His voice was steady, but his pulse was a frantic, erratic beat against his ribs. Not her name. I want to know where she came from. Every house she's worked in, every person she's spoken to. He realized then that the wine hadn't been an act of dominance, and it had been a tactical error. He had drawn a circle around her, making the invisible woman the center of the room. As he watched her from across the floor, still standing tall, still wearing the crimson stain like a badge of honor, the first crack appeared in his fortress of certainty. He had spent his life making people disappear, but for the first time, he felt like he was the one being watched. He wasn't just the king of the ballroom anymore. He was a man standing on a trap door. And the girl with the red apron had her hand on the lever. The summons arrived not with a request, but with the heavy, rhythmic thud of black SUVs idling outside Nia's cramped apartment. In the back of the lead vehicle, the air was thick with the scent of leather and cold filtered air, a stark contrast to the humidity of the city streets. Nia sat in the center of the plush seat, the red-stained apron folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like an honored guest who had simply been waiting for her carriage. When the gates of the Choi estate swung open, they revealed a fortress of glass and steel perched on the edge of the cliffs, a monument to a man who feared nothing but the truth. Nia was led through a labyrinth of minimalist hallways, her footsteps silent on the slate floors, until she was ushered into a private study that smelled of old paper and expensive scotch. Dae-Hyun stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room, watching the moonlight fracture against the dark ocean below. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. He didn't turn when the door clicked shut behind her. "The wine I ruined," he began, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "It was a 1945 Romane Conti, a bottle worth more than your life." "Money has always been your way of measuring worth, Dae-Hyun," Nia replied. Her voice was steady, lacking the frantic edge of a servant in peril. "But the stain on my apron isn't what's bothering you. It's the stain on your memory." Dae-Hyun turned then, his eyes burning with a clinical, focused anger. He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping inches from her, his presence a towering shadow. "You were a ghost at a party, a piece of the scenery. Now you're in my house, speaking my name as if we are equals. Tell me why I shouldn't have you erased before the sun rises." Nia didn't flinch. She leaned in slightly, close enough to see the micro flicker of his pupils. "Because if I don't check in by dawn, a digital file is sent to every major news outlet in the country. It's titled August 14th. I think you know the contents. It details the night the foundations of this very house were poured over a man who didn't deserve to die." The air in the room seemed to freeze. For the first time, the king of the underworld looked as though he had been struck. His jaw tightened, the muscles corded and rigid. He had intended to interrogate a girl, to break a servant, but he found himself caught in the orbit of a woman who had been calculating his downfall while she refilled his glass. "Who are you?" he whispered, the command replaced by a raw, jagged curiosity. Nia offered that same knowing smile, the one that had haunted his dreams since the gala. "I'm the person you chose to humiliate in front of the world," she said, her voice dropping to a silk-soft murmur. "And now, I'm the only person who can save you from yourself. So sit down, Dae-Hyun. We have a lot to discuss, and for once, you aren't the one setting the terms." She walked past him and took the seat behind his desk, the power in the room shifting with the grace of a turning tide. The interrogation had begun, but the hunter was now the one in the chair. Dae-Hyun remained frozen behind his own desk, a man suddenly stripped of his armor in the sanctuary of his own home. He looked at Nia, really looked at her, and saw for the first time that the simple ponytail and service uniform had been a soldier's camouflage. The air in the study felt heavy, charged with the realization that the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted. "You're lying," he said, though the conviction was absent from his voice. He reached for a heavy crystal decanter, his fingers brushing the glass with a tremor he couldn't entirely mask. August 14th was a ghost story. I burned the book myself. You burned the physical evidence, Dae-Hyun. You didn't burn the witness who was hiding in the pantry of the beach house that night, Nia countered, her voice dropping into a register of cold, crystalline truth. I was 12 years old. I saw the flash of the muzzle. I heard the last breath of the man you called your mentor, and I saw where you put the shell casing you missed. The decanter hit the tray with a sharp, dissonant ring. Dae-Hyun's face went past pale to a ghostly, translucent gray. That shell casing had been the one loose thread in a perfect tapestry of crime, a phantom that had haunted his early rise to power until he convinced himself it was a myth. I don't just have the casing, Nia continued, her composure absolute. I have the ledger your mentor kept, the one detailing the offshore accounts that fund your current expansion. It's all digitized, encrypted, and it's tied to my heartbeat. She leaned forward, in resting her hands on the mahogany surface. It's a dead man's switch. Every morning at 6 a.m., I enter a code into a private server. If that code isn't entered, or if my vitals, monitored by a device you'll never find, stop transmitting, the encryption breaks. The files go to the Federal Bureau and the rival families you've been systematic in betraying. By 7 a.m., your empire is a smoking crater. By noon, you are a dead man walking. Dae-Hyun lunged suddenly, his hand slamming onto the desk, and his face inches from hers. The king was gone, replaced by a cornered predator. You think this makes you safe? I could keep you in a cell. I could keep you alive and miserable for decades. And who would enter the code? Nia asked, her smile returning, sharp, sad, and triumphant. You can't kill me, and you can't let me out of your sight. If I trip, if I catch a fever, if your men get too rough, you lose everything. You didn't bring me here to interrogate me, Dae-Hyun. You brought me here to realize that my life is now the most valuable thing you own. The stalemate was total. Dae-Hyun recoiled as if stung, the silence of the room swelling until it was deafening. He looked at her not with hatred, but with a terrifying newfound reverence. He had spent his life seeking a partner who understood the weight of a secret, and he had found her in the girl he had tried to drown in red wine. They were locked in a lethal embrace, two ghosts bound by a single night of blood, waiting for the sun to rise on a world neither of them fully controlled anymore. The stillness of the study was shattered not by words, but by the sudden rhythmic thrumming of rotors cutting through the coastal fog. The sound was too heavy for a private craft, too synchronized for anything but a tactical insertion. Red light began to pulse against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the silent, sweeping alarm of the estate's perimeter breach. So Dae-Hyun's transition from shock to survival was instantaneous. He didn't move toward Nia to silence her. He moved toward the console beneath his desk. Triads, he rasped, his eyes scanning a hidden monitor. They've been waiting for a moment of weakness. They don't want the secret, Nia. They want the head of the man who keeps it. A muffled explosion rocked the lower levels of the mansion, the vibration traveling up through the slate floors and rattling the crystal decanter. Then the power flickered, plunged the room into darkness, and then hissed back to life under the dim crimson glow of the emergency generators. If they get into this room, your dead man's switch becomes a reality, Nia said, her voice tight but remarkably devoid of panic. She stood up, her silhouette sharp against the red emergency lights. And if you're dead, I have no reason to hold back the tide. We both die tonight, or we both walk out of here." Dae-Hyun looked at her, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. For years, he had operated on the belief that he was the only one capable of holding his world together. Now, his survival depended on the woman who had spent a decade planning his ruin. He reached into a hidden compartment in the mahogany desk and pulled out two things: a compact firearm and a sleek, encrypted tablet. "The server room is in the sub-basement," he said, handing her the tablet. "It's shielded. If they jam the cellular signal, your heartbeat monitor won't be able to ping the satellite, your switch will trigger prematurely, and the police will be here for my assets before we even clear the driveway. You need to stay on the internal network to keep the loop active." "Then we go down," Nia replied, her fingers already flying across the screen to stabilize the connection. They moved into the hallway, a surreal tableau of enemies bound by necessity. Dae-Hyun took point, and his movements clinical and lethal as he cleared the corners, while Nia stayed at his back, her eyes fixed on the data streams that represented his life and her revenge. They were no longer the Mafia boss and the Maid, they were two halves of a single desperate pulse. As they reached the heavy steel doors of the service elevator, a burst of gunfire echoed from the grand staircase. Dae-Hyun shoved Nia inside and stepped in after her, his body acting as a shield against the darkness of the hallway. In the cramped, vibrating space of the elevator, the scent of the spilled wine on her apron mingled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. He looked at her then, his gaze intense and searching. "Why help me? You could let them kill me and take your chances with the chaos." "Because I want justice, Dae-Hyun, not a massacre," she said, her steady gaze meeting his. "And because I'm not finished with you yet." The elevator jolted to a halt. The doors slid open to reveal the humming, blue-lit sanctuary of the server room, but the sound of heavy boots on the stairs above told them the sanctuary was already compromised. The king and the ghost stepped out into the blue light together, ready to defend the secrets that had nearly destroyed them. The blue hum of the server room was a cold, digital sanctuary, were a stark contrast to the violence echoing in the floors above. As the fans whirred, processing the data that held Dae-Hyun's life in the balance, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a raw, jagged silence. Dae-Hyun stood by the reinforced door, his weapon lowered but his body still coiled like a spring. He watched Nia as she worked the tablet, her face illuminated by the ghost light of the screens. "You said you were in the pantry that night," Dae-Hyun said, and his voice stripped of its usual iron. "August 14th, you weren't just a witness, you were his daughter." Nia didn't look up from the monitor, but her fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second. "His name was Nia Robinson. He wasn't just your mentor, Dae-Hyun. He was the man who taught you that power required a conscience, and you killed him because you thought his conscience was a weakness." She finally turned to face him, the red-stained apron still tied around her waist, a visceral reminder of the blood that had been spilled long before the wine. "My mother died of grief a year later. I spent the next decade being a ghost, moving through the houses of the men who helped you climb. I didn't just want to see you fall. I wanted to see the look on your face when you realize that the people you step on are the ones who remember where you buried the shovel." Dae-Hyun looked at her, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt a crushing weight in his chest that wasn't anger. He saw the mid-20s woman for who she truly was, a survivor forged in the fires he had lit. The Maid was a masterpiece of discipline, a mirror held up to his own hollow soul. He had spent his life convinced that people were either predators or prey, but Nia was something else entirely. She was the reckoning. "He loved you like a son," Nia whispered, her eyes shining with a localized fire. He told me once that you had a spark of something great. He didn't know you'd use that spark to burn everything he built." The coldness that had defined Dae-Hyun for a decade began to thaw into a painful, suffocating clarity. He looked at the firearm in his hand, then at the girl who had every right to watch him bleed out. He had humiliated her in front of the world's elite, yet here she was, maintaining the heartbeat of his empire to ensure he didn't die a dog's death in a basement. "I didn't think anyone was left," he rasped, the words catching in his throat. "I told myself it was for the legacy, for the Choi name." "Legacy isn't built on silence, Dae-Hyun. It's built on what stays behind when the room goes quiet," she said. Outside the heavy doors, the sound of an explosion signaled the final breach of the sub-basement. Dae-Hyun stepped toward her, not as a captor, but as a man seeking gravity. He realized that the secret wasn't just his darkest sin, that it was the only thing that made him human. For the first time, he saw her not as a threat to be managed, but as the only light he had ever truly known. The price of the secret was finally being paid, not in blood, but in the devastating realization that he had destroyed the only family he ever had, and the woman standing before him was the only one left to forgive him. The dawn light broke over the jagged cliffs, bleeding a pale, uncertain gold into the study where the air still smelled of ozone and old secrets. The sirens of the rival triad crews had faded into the distance, silenced by a defense they hadn't expected, a defense coordinated by a man with a gun and a woman with a heartbeat tied to a digital apocalypse. Dae-Hyun stood by the shattered remains of his window, the morning breeze pulling at the collar of his ruined suit. He wasn't looking at the horizon, he was watching Nia. She sat at his mahogany desk, her fingers finally still. The red apron, once a symbol of her invisibility and her humiliation, lay draped over the back of the chair. In its place, she wore the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had looked into the abyss and seen it blink first. "The files are back behind the encryption," Nia said, her voice clear in the morning stillness. "The dead man's switch is active, but the timer has been extended. I'm not sending the data, Dae-Hyun. Not today." Dae-Hyun turned, then his movements lacking their usual clinical sharpness. He looked at the desk, the throne of his empire, and realized it no longer felt like a seat of power. It felt like a responsibility. "You're giving me a chance," he rasped, "after everything I took from you." "Why?" "Because my father believed in a legacy of conscience," Nia replied, standing up to meet his gaze. "And because a dead king is useless, but a king who owes his life to the truth is powerful. I didn't spend 10 years in the shadows just to see another monster take your place. I want the Choi Empire to become what it was meant to be before you drew that gun on August 14th. Dae-Hyun crossed the room, stopping just outside her personal space. The air between them no longer crackled with the heat of a predator and prey. It held the heavy, profound gravity of a homecoming. He reached out, his hand hesitating before he gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. It was a gesture of surrender, a silent acknowledgement that his reign of isolation was over. "I spent my life trying to be the only person who mattered," he whispered. "I thought having no one made me untouchable. I was wrong." "You were just waiting for someone who wasn't afraid to see you," Nia said. The alliance was forged not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in the quiet wreckage of a night that should have ended them both. The secret of August 14th remained, but it was no longer a weapon held to his throat. It was the foundation of a new, shared reality. Weeks later, when the doors to the Choi headquarters opened, the world saw a different kind of power. Dae-Hyun Choi no longer walked a step ahead of everyone else. Beside him was Nia, no longer the maid, no longer invisible. She wore the elegance of a woman who had reclaimed her name and her history. The city's elite watched in hushed, terrified awe as the Mafia boss and the woman who had smiled through his wine took their place at the head of the table. The king was still dangerous, and his world would always have shadows, but he was no longer alone in the dark. Beside him stood his gravity, his conscience, and his partner, the only person in the world powerful enough to keep him human.